Okay, we're ready to continue our study of the third book of the Psalms, Psalm 74 today. So if you will, let's turn over to verse 1, and we read, a contemplation, or as the Tanakh has in several other translations, a maskil. And we've covered maskils before, maskils and silahs and various other things. And again, a contemplation or maskil is to, meditate over the whole of the message that's contained within the psalm, whereas the selah is, think about what we just stated, or, be considering that with what's coming next. And it's kind of in part, meditating on parts of a psalm, and then a maskil is taking the whole of the psalm into your meditative state. Okay, so we have a maskil of Asaph. Again, we've covered before, Asaph writes, this is the second in this series, and there are several more, because he does 12 altogether in all of the Psalms. O God, why have you cast us off forever? Or the New American Standard, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Or Tanakh, why do you fume in anger at the sheep of your pasture? Now, these questions are posed by Israel, which are, we know in several places, especially Ezekiel 34, the sheep of God's pasture. Israel are the sheep. That is all of the Israelites. Israel itself is the nation of the sheep of God's pasture. And these questions are paralleled. Hold your place here. Let's go over to Lamentations, because here in Lamentations, right after the book of Jeremiah, these questions are paralleled at the very conclusion of this third book of the festival scroll. And here we read in chapter 5, verse 20. We'll again in chapter 5, verse 20. Why? And the question is, again, being posed to God, why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Turn us back to you, O Eternal, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us, or the New Revised Standard completes the verse, and are angry with us beyond measure. Now, Psalm 74 focuses on the confusion being experienced by God's people. In this case, primarily, based upon what goes on in the remainder of this psalm, primarily the Jews in the land of Israel. And again, as far as we're concerned, this is at the close of the age. We have a psalm here that pertains to certain historical events for us, but at the time that this psalm was written, in the time of David, all was yet into the future. But the final fulfillment is in our day and time. And so the Jews, again, or the God's people, are wanting, they're confused over this state as to why God allows them and the city of Jerusalem to be conquered by their undesirable enemies. Why does God allow this to happen? Now, the Apostle Paul, back in Romans, let's go to Romans chapter 10, he acknowledged here in Romans chapter 10 that God had refused to intervene for most of Israel because of their continued hard-hearted rebellion against him throughout a multitude of centuries. Here in the last verse of Romans 10, now the Apostle Paul here is beginning to address the fact that God has called a number of Gentiles, and Gentiles seem to be more keen on following God or seeking God than his own people, his chosen nation. And so he comes down to verse 21. He says, but to Israel, he says, that is, God says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary. Some translations have rebellious, others have stubborn people. I stretch out my hands. I have pleaded with them not to forsake me. And yet, that's what they are certainly doing. Going on then, in chapter 11, verse 1, very next verse, I say then, Paul states, has God cast away his people? Now, the intent of what he means here, based upon what follows, is has God completely washed his hands of all of Israel? Has he done that? Are they cast off completely? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul says, God, I have a relationship with God. God is working with me. He hasn't cast me off. And so, no, he hasn't done that to everyone. Now, Paul goes on to show here, as we progress on through chapter 11, that God has forsaken the disobedient, who were definitely the majority of Israel, but not all of Israel. He hasn't completely washed his hands of all. And Paul then went on, here later in chapter 11, down here around verse 25, he went on here to show that in addition to being forsaken for their hard-hearted rebellion, the vast majority of Israel's descendants would remain forsaken by God for another reason until Christ returns in glory. Note verse 25. He says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion," or the New English translation says, "so that you may not be conceited. That hardening, that is hardening of the heart, this rebellious, stubborn tendency of Israel, has happened to Israel until the fullness," or New Revised Standard better says, "the full number of the Gentiles has come in," that is, come into the church. Because God has a certain number. He hasn't told us what percentage of the church, but there's a certain percentage that he wants to be of Gentile descent and not just of Israel descent. That is, those who are not descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to others as well. And so, verse 26 goes on, or Revised English Bible, once that has happened, all Israel will be saved. That is, the majority that are so hard-hearted, there's going to be a change. All of Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins, which again, he's referring back to what Jeremiah wrote in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. That covenant, not like the one that he made at Sinai, but the new covenant. So, again, Paul addresses this being cast off or being forsaken. And the reason he gives is because I've stretched out my hands to disobedient people, stubborn, who will not heed me. All right, we move on then to verse 2 of Psalm 74. And here it states, "Remember your congregation. You've forsaken us, but remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old," or you, Tanakh says, you made yours long ago. You made us your nation long ago. The people, the tribe, or the people of your inheritance, which you have redeemed. This is a people you have redeemed, that you bought. This Mount Zion, or the New Revised Standard says, "Remember Mount Zion where you have dwelt." Because that's where it's located. Mount Zion is where your people are to be. In this verse, which refers to part of the Song of Moses, in fact, let's go back to Exodus chapter 15. Israel appeals to God to remember the special relationship that he had made with them when he took them for himself out of Egypt, chose them over all other nations to be his holy nation, and led them to his land that he had promised to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where he made his dwelling on the earth, Mount Zion. Here in Exodus 15 and verse 13, here in Moses' song, this song of Moses, "You in your mercy have led forth the people whom you have redeemed." So see, we're going to see this ties directly into verse 2 of Psalm 74. The people whom you have redeemed, you have guided them. He redeemed them. He bought them. He brought them out of Egypt. That's the redemption that he's talking about. You guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. You stayed with them throughout the 40 years wandering. Skipping down to the mid part of verse 16, it says, the people, it goes on, the people whom you have purchased, people you have purchased, you will bring them, verse 17, in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Eternal, which you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Eternal, which your hands have established. And so we can see how Asaph borrowed from the Song of Moses to make this statement back in Psalm 74. All right, so Psalm 74, verse 3, from the Tanakh translation, bestir yourself because of the perpetual tumult. New King James says desolations. The New Revised Standard says ruins. Because of the perpetual desolations or ruins, all the outrages of the enemy in the sanctuary. All of the outrages. More than one outrage that takes place in God's sanctuary. Now, this appeal is for God to take action. Bestir yourself. In other words, take action. This is an appeal for God to take action, and it is the first of the appeals, or I should say the first direct prophecy concerning the details of the destruction that would be unleashed multiple times on the place where God dwelt among Israel. Not just once. And again, this was written back in the time of David. First temple hadn't even been built. Long time before the second would be, and the things that would take place. But this is an appeal for God to take action. And again, this was prophesied to happen, and it's happened more than once. The first enemy that destroyed the temple was, of course, the army of Babylon. The second was the army of Rome. Now, in between the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, the destruction of the altar, the defilement of the altar in the, on the Temple Mount, there where the temples, where the temple had been, or the temple had been rebuilt by then, the temple of Zerubbabel, but that altar was defiled by the Seleucids, by Antiochus Epiphanes. He defiled the altar, stopped the worship. And so that place, the place of God's sanctuary, again, bestir yourself because of the perpetual tumult or desolations. And again, this is foreseeing that there would be more than one time where worship would be obliterated and stopped at the sanctuary of God. Now, the final enemy that will abolish, let's turn over to Daniel chapter 11. The final enemy that will abolish the worship of God at the same site on Mount Zion will be the beast. Will be the beast. Note here in Daniel 11, verse 40. I'll read from the New International Translation. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him, or come against him like a whirlwind, the New King James says. Now, the king of the south has been over and done with. We're not looking for another king of the south. That was done earlier. And of course, the king of the north did come, and he came against him as Mussolini. But Mussolini, though he was able to go into North Africa, was not able to go into the glorious land that is the Holy Land. And so it says, we'll come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships, World War II. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. He did not do it then. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon, or the chief part of the Ammonites, will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt with the Libyans and the Nubians, or the Ethiopians, as the New King James has, in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Now, before that happens, though, verse 45, he will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, Mount Zion. Yet he will come to his end, or he will meet his doom, and no one will help him. And so the king of the north, at the very end, is going to bring about the final desecration and stoppage of worship there in Jerusalem at Mount Zion. This final abolishment of the worship of God at Mount Zion will be according to the manner in which Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the king of the north at that time, ended worship there in 167 BC. 167 BC. He came in, abolished the sacrifices, and set up the abomination of desolation. Now, Antiochus's abomination or abolition of the continual burnt offering here in chapter 12, we are told here, will be repeated. What Antiochus did will be repeated by the king of the north at the time of the end. Because it says here in verse 11 of Daniel 12, I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible, "From the time the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days." So this is an end-time fulfillment of what Antiochus did. You know, he did not destroy the temple. There is no temple today, and there is no likelihood of the temple being built until after the return of Christ, according to what we read in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 and through 46 or so. All right, now let's go back to Psalm 74. Talked about the many times that there would be desolations, and he continues on telling us specifics about the desolations, at least some of them. Verse 4 of Psalm 74, Revised English Bible has, "The shouts of your enemies," that is, the enemies of God, "fill your temple." Now, how could they do that unless they entered into the temple? Well, that's obvious, they did. They planted their standards there as tokens of victory. Now, we don't have any record that I have found regarding what the Babylonian army did when it went in there, but Josephus does tell us that the Romans brought their standards in to the temple and placed them there. So Josephus does concur with what this says regarding the destruction of the second temple. They brought it crashing down, like woodmen plying their axes in the forest. Verse 6 goes on in the New Revised Standard, "And then, with hatchets and hammers, they smashed all its carved work," or all its engravings. Verse 7, the New King James, "They have set fire to your sanctuary. They have defiled the dwelling place of your name to the ground." These verses prophesy of the destructions of the first temple by the Babylonians and the second temple by the Romans. Before setting fire to them, either time, the invaders battered the gold-plated engraved walls and doors of the interior of the temple. All of this, you remember when it was built, the stones were all cut, and made sure they would perfectly fit. Then they were brought and placed quietly as you can put big stones together. They put they got all the stones in place, and then they came through with wood, and they, put panels up all on the inside, and they had craftsmen that engraved flowers and flower buds and palm trees and cherubim, all over. And then once that was done, they came in and gold-plated the whole thing, ceiling and all. And so it was all gold on the inside. And so we have hatchets and hammers. These warriors from Babylon and Rome were trying to cut the gold plate off of the walls. Is the reason for the hatchets and all. And then, whatever they couldn't get, they set fire to the wood then and melted what they could of the gold so that they could accumulate that and haul that off. And so that's what this is speaking about here. Going on in verse 8, the New Living Translation has, "Then they thought, let's destroy everything. So they burned down all the places where God was worshiped." The army of the beast is the end-time abomination of desolation. We know that because of what we read back in the gospel accounts. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, Here, Christ tells the disciples who had asked him the question about the signs to look for. And here in verse 15 of Matthew 24, he said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." In other words, there are things that Daniel wrote that you better be aware of when this event finally happens, or you're going to be up a creek. That's what that means. Whoso reads, let him understand. You better go back and make sure you understand what Daniel wrote. Now, over in Luke chapter 21, and in verse 20, in Luke's account, Luke specifically tells us what that abomination is, that abomination of desolation. Luke 21, verse 20, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near." All right? The armies of the beast are the desolation, are the abomination that makes Jerusalem, and especially the temple, desolate. That's what it is. Now, that army will destroy much property and kill many of the Jews who live there. Going on in verse 21, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. Let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance." Or the New International says, this is the time of punishment. Time of punishment that God pronounced long ago. "That all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people." What people? The people who live there in Judea, where this army, this abomination, comes in and desolates and destroys so much. "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled," which is 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Now again, this destruction was prophesied as, it says here, the beginning of the days of vengeance. That is, at the time of the end. That's when this is to be. Back in Hosea chapter 9, Hosea addresses this. Hosea chapter 9, verse 7. The New International has, "The days of punishment are coming. The days of reckoning or recompense are at hand. Let Israel know this, because your sins are so many and your hostility so great." That is, their hostility toward God. Carnal minds. Remember, carnal mind is hostile toward God. So that's what they were. Hard-hearted, carnal-minded. And so God's going to have to bring this on. God made it very clear that those days would begin, those days of recompense, by sending the beast to punish the nation that falsely claims to represent him. You know, Isaiah chapter 10, we've covered that many times before, but let's go to Zechariah chapter 14, because the beast, we're told here, will lead many nations in his conquest of Jerusalem. Zechariah 14, verse 1, I'll read from the New English translation. It says, "Behold," well, the New King James says, "Behold, the day of the eternal." New English translation goes on, "Behold, the day of the eternal is about to come, when your possessions will be divided as plunder in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to wage war." God gathers them. The beast leads them. "The city will be taken, its houses plundered, and the women raped. Then half of the city will go into exile or captivity, depending on your translation, but the remainder of the people will not be taken away." That's what is to happen. And again, as verse 8 says here in Psalm 74, "Then they sought, let's destroy everything, so they burnt down all the places where God was worshipped." You need to remember that all people will be required to take the mark of the beast. They're going to be required to do that and to worship only the beast. That means that all worship of the true God will not be allowed. There will be no allowance for that. And there will be no places for his people to assemble. That's what this means. The places of worship, because you can't worship anything but the beast. That's what we're told back in the book of Revelation. All right, going on in Psalm 74 and verse 9, the complete Jewish Bible has, we see no signs. There is no prophet anymore. None of us knows how long it will last. That is, when this happens, when this begins, and as time moves forward through the time of tribulation. During the time of the outpouring of his punishment, God will not reveal its complete duration. Amos chapter 8. Amos chapter 8 and verse 7. I'll read from the New Living Translation. Amos 8, verse 7. Now the Eternal has sworn this oath by his own name, the pride of Israel. He is the pride of Israel. I will never forget the wicked things you have done. This is what God says to Israel. I will never forget the wicked things you've done. The earth will tremble for your deeds, and everyone will mourn. The ground will rise like the Nile River at flood time. It will heave up, then sink again. Speaking of great earthquakes that's moving the ground, it's what that's talking of. In that day, says the sovereign eternal, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth while it is still day. You know, the fifth bowl plague is plague of darkness, incredible darkness, maybe what it's talking about here. Verse 10, I will turn your celebrations into times of mourning and your singing into weeping. You will wear funeral clothes and shave your heads to show your sorrow, as if your only son had died. How very bitter that day will be. The time is surely coming, says the sovereign eternal, when I will send a famine on the land. Not a famine of bread or water, but of hearing the words of the eternal, or the New English translation of hearing divine revelation, which are the words of the eternal. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from border to border, that is the land of Israel, searching for the word of the eternal, or a revelation from the eternal, the New English translation has, but they will not find it. Now, this passage indicates, again, Psalm 74, verse 9, indicates that either those in Judea will not have access to the two witnesses, or the two witnesses will not reveal the total length of time the Jews in the land of Israel will be punished. Now, remember, the beast comes into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is conquered. It will be completely under the control of the beast for 1,260 days, 3.5 times. That's what we're told. He's going to completely, the times of the Gentiles, 3.5 times. Jerusalem will be trodden under by the feet of the Gentiles. And that's the time that the beast will be there. But then he leaves when he hears about the massive army that's getting ready to come from the north, from the Euphrates. He leaves Jerusalem. Daniel chapter 12, verse 44. We read it a few minutes ago. So, out of the east and the north, he takes off. And so Jerusalem, yes, that 1,260 days is over, but there's still the bowl plagues. The beast is not killed until the end. The last bowl plague is poured out. So what is the duration? The Bible does not tell us. So, again, we see no signs. There is no prophet. None of us knows how long it will last. Even Jerusalem, even though the beast won't be there, there will be, apparently, from what we read in the book of Revelation, some allowance for the Jews to do more than what they had been. Still, the vast majority of the country is still under control of the army of the beast. Now, going on in Psalm 74, verse 10. O God, how long will the adversary reproach, or Revised English Bible, utter his taunts? How long will the adversary utter his taunts Will the enemy blaspheme your name forever? Now, these questions are similar to or related to the saints who have been martyred through time that we find back in Revelation chapter 6. And again, we know that these are people who are dead, but their prayers have been preserved. And so those prayers are referred to here by coming from the souls under the altar, those who had been martyred. Revelation 6, verse 10, I'll read from the New English Translation. They cried out with a loud voice, "How long?" Again, Psalm 74:10, "Oh God, how long? How long, sovereign master, holy and true? How long before you judge those who live on the earth and avenge our blood?" How long? Each of them was given a long white robe, and they were told to rest for a little longer until the full number was reached of both their fellow servants and their brothers who were going to be killed just as they had been. So, again, there's something told there, but still no definitive amount of time. Daniel, back in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel witnessed a vision of angels, or 3 angels, which reveals that a period of 3.5 years will elapse from the time the beast conquers Jerusalem until the first resurrection. However, the passage does not indicate how much longer the beast will be allowed to continue after the 7th trump is sounded. He will continue, again, as I just mentioned, until after the bowl plagues have been completed. And again, the length of their administration, their outpouring, again, unknown. But here in chapter 12, verse 6, "And one of these angels, said to the man," which was another angel, "clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders," now, some translations, those awful things, and other times it's those wonderful things, different translations have, but basically these things, these wonders, how long, these signs, how long will they be? "Then I heard the man clothed in linen," this is Daniel telling us his experience, "who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time," 3.5 times. "And when the power of the holy people," who are the holy people at the end? Who are destroyed, put to death? 2 witnesses. Okay? "And when the power of the holy people," the 2 witnesses, "has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished." Now, Daniel doesn't have the information, but John was given that information that the 2 witnesses are going to be put to death. They're going to be killed 3.5 days before the 7th trump. That's what we're told. But Daniel didn't know that, and it was not revealed to him. And he wanted to know more, and the angel said, "You don't need to know it, you're going to be dead. So it's irrelevant whether you know this or not, Daniel. Just, go to your grave in peace, and it will all happen when it's supposed to happen." All right, back in Psalm 74 and verse 11. "Why do you withdraw your hand," or hold back your hand, the Tanakh says, "even your right hand? Why do you remain inactive?" Is basically what that passage is in the New English translation. So your hand, even, why do you withdraw or hold back your hand, even your right hand? The New English translation, why do you remain inactive? Why aren't you taking action? Take it out of your bosom and destroy them. Take your right hand out of your bosom and destroy these people who are blaspheming your name. This question and urgent request make another reference to the Song of Moses back in Exodus chapter 15. And this is where God, in Moses' song, unleashes the power of his right hand to destroy the army of the Pharaoh of Egypt. here in Exodus 15 and verse 6. Your right hand, O Eternal, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Eternal, has dashed the enemy in pieces. Skipping down to verse 12, you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. A reference to the Red Sea closing over the army of Egypt. Now, this request here in Psalm 74, take out of your bosom and destroy them. Take your right hand out of your bosom and destroy them. This request shows that the Jews will fail to understand, those in the land of Israel, that God will be responsible for the calamity that they will be required to experience because of their failure to be faithful to Him, to be fully obedient to His commands and His instructions. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 26, the third book of the Torah. Chapter 26, blessings and cursings chapter, as we call it. Let's go down here to verse 14. After God has talked about providing the blessings, as long as they would walk in His way and do what He told them. But we come to verse 14, but He says, if, however, you do not obey me, this is Israel, if you do not obey me and keep all these commandments, if you reject my statutes and abhor my regulations so that you do not keep all my commandments and you break my covenant, I, for my part, will do this to you. I will inflict horror on you, consumption and fever, which diminish eyesight and drain away the vitality of life. You will sow your seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you. You will be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee when there is no one pursuing you. And so God warned them, you don't obey me, you become carnal, you stay carnal-minded, you're hard-hearted, this is what's going to happen. Now let's go over to Lamentations, the third book of the festival scroll. Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 6. Lamentations 2 verse 6. And He, a reference here in context to God, He has done violence to His tabernacle. As if it were a garden, He has destroyed His place of assembly. The Eternal has caused the appointed feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. In His burning indignation, He has spurned the king and the priest. The Eternal has spurned His altar. He has abandoned His sanctuary. He has given up the walls of her palaces into the hand of the enemy. They have made a noise in the house of the Eternal as on the day of a set feast, which we already read a verse earlier in Psalm 74 that talked about them making noise inside the temple. And in Isaiah, let's go back to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 13. I'll read from the New Living Translation, Isaiah 9:13. For after all this punishment that he talks about previous to this, after all this punishment, the people will still not repent. They will not seek the Eternal of heaven's armies. Therefore, in a single day, the Eternal will destroy both the head and the tail, the noble palm branch and the lowly reed. The leaders of Israel are the head, and the lying prophets are the tail. For the leaders of the people have misled them. They have led them down the path of destruction. That is why the Lord takes no pleasure in the young men and shows no mercy even to the widows and orphans, for they are all wicked hypocrites. Every last one, God is saying. And they all speak foolishness. Rather than speaking His word, they speak foolishness. But even then, the Eternal's anger will not be satisfied. Once He destroys all of the leaders, not going to be satisfied. His fist is still poised to strike Israel, not Israel's enemies. This is God that's doing this. God is the one responsible for the calamity. In Isaiah chapter 10, just across the page, verse 5, O Assyrian, the King James has, the rod of my anger and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. So this is a reference to the beast. We've gone through this many, many times. This is the beast. And he's going to be sent. But God calls him the rod of God's anger. I will send him, verse 6, against an ungodly, King James has, hypocritical nation. Well, we just read over here in verse 17 of the earlier chapter, they are all wicked hypocrites. And so here he says, I'll send him against a hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath I will give him charge to seize the spoil, take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. So we go back to Psalm 74. And again, why do you withdraw or hold back your hand, even your right hand? Take it out of your bosom and destroy them. Because they don't see what they're going through is for their good, to get them turned back around. Verse 12 goes on in Psalm 74. I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible. God has been my king from earliest times, acting to save or working salvation throughout all the earth. This is what Israel says. This is what the Jews say. This is those who acknowledge their descent from Israel. Now present the reason why they expect God to come to their aid. Why? The past experiences of Israel. God came to their aid time and time again, even when they went astray, especially during the time of the judges. But God did things for them other than that. He saved Israel by delivering the nation from slavery in Egypt. They now begin, the descendants of Israel who are undergoing the end-time problems, they now begin to list powerful things here in the following verses that he did to save their ancestors. And they do this in hopes of convincing him to save them from the bondage that they find themselves in at the end of the age. Verse 13, you divided the sea by your strength. You divided the sea by your strength. God miraculously divided the waters of the Red Sea so that Israel could walk between the walls of water. Again, the walls of water out of the land of Egypt. There was a pathway, dry land, all the way across from the western side of the Red Sea in Egypt to the eastern side in Midian. And they were able to walk right through. Verse 13 goes on in the New English Translation, you shattered the heads of the sea monster. Moffat has, you shattered the dragon's heads. Dragon singular, dragon's heads. In the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You fed him to the people who live along the coast, or better in the New American Standard, you fed him to the creatures of the wilderness. Now in this case, this sea monster or dragon refers to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Back in Ezekiel chapter 29, Ezekiel 29 and verse 3. New International translates, here the Pharaoh is being addressed, speak to him and say, this is what the sovereign eternal says. I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. You say the Nile belongs to me, I made it for myself. Some translations have, I think, sea monster, some serpent, whatever. But verse 14 talks about Leviathan. Now, since Leviathan is also identified as a dragon, described very, very clearly in Job chapter 41, he's also identified as a serpent and sea monster. Because of that, the name Leviathan is also attributed to the Pharaoh. Okay? Leviathan is a sea creature. It's a creature that plows through the seas. The seas represent humanity. This is a creature in the spirit realm. But in this case, Leviathan is being applied to Pharaoh. His heads, plural heads, refer to the best officers that he had in his army. And those officers were drowned and crushed when the waters of the Red Sea returned to their normal level. The dead bodies of the Egyptian army were eaten by birds, aquatic creatures, crabs and whatever, their bodies up on the beach, land animals along the seashore. And so it says, you fed him to the people who live along the coast, rather the creatures, as a number of translations have, rather than people. In Exodus chapter 14 tells us, refers to this, Exodus 14 and verse 30. So the Eternal saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. So this is the reason why Psalm 74 brings out what it does here in verse 14. All right, back in Psalm 74, verse 15. The New English translation translates it, you broke open the spring and the stream. The New Living Translation has, you caused the springs and streams to gush forth. God miraculously caused rocks to split open and provide water for Israel to drink during the time they wandered during the 40 years in the wilderness. You've probably seen pictures of that gigantic slab there's almost a perfect cut through it. And when you look at the area around, there was tremendous amount of erosion created by water. So that was apparently maybe the first place where God gave Israel water in the desert. But this is what it's talking about. He miraculously did that. Verse 15 goes on in the New Living, and you dried up rivers that never run dry. Well, God miraculously stopped the flow of the Jordan River so that Israel could walk across the promised land without getting their feet wet, because it says the riverbed was dry. So he had all of the water backed up by maybe an invisible dam he put there, but he stopped the flow of water so that, again, it would dry out and they could walk across. Verse 16, the day is yours, the night also is yours. You have prepared or established, some translations say, you have prepared or established the light and the sun. After pointing out the miraculous interventions God had performed for Israel in the past, the Jews at the close of the age, who know that God refuses, at least has refused up to this point to intervene for them, now point to the infinite power that God possesses. Day and night are the result of God fixing the rotation of the earth. Without the rotation of the earth, there's not going to be a day and a night. You can't have the sun disappearing if all you have is one surface. You're going to have to turn it around the other way. Okay? So, the rotation of the earth, God did that. Day is possible only because God created the sun to provide light to the side of the earth facing the sun when it rotates, and the night is the result of being on the side of the earth not facing the sun. Because the only way you're going to get night with that brilliant star that we have in the center of this solar system. But God did that. He has that power. Verse 17, you have set all the borders, or the Tanakh translates, you have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. Every ocean, sea, river, desert, mountain chain, every one of them were set in place by God. He designed it, and he did so for a reason, to keep people separated so they wouldn't kill each other off too soon. He has made certain. The seasons are the result of God tilting the axis of the earth about 23.5 degrees so that as it goes around the sun, the sun moves and is able to hit all points other than it hits even those points to a degree. You can see sunlight may not be coming straight overhead, but again, God did that. God's people here correctly concluded that He, who possesses such incredible power, could easily step in and rescue them from the very tenuous situation they find themselves in at the close of the age, when everyone is required to take the mark of the beast. Verse 18, Tanakh translates, "Be mindful of how the enemy blasphemes the eternal, how base people revile your name." Now, after listing a few of the conditions that God has established by His infinite power, His forsaken people now appeal to Him to take notice of the abominable actions of the beast and his followers that God sent against Jerusalem and the Jewish people. God sent him. We saw that in Isaiah 10. But why is God putting up with all of this blasphemy? The beast will blaspheme God throughout the time he is allowed to rule. We're told that back over in Revelation 13 when John writes what he saw in vision. Revelation 13 and verse 5. And here in the context, the he here is the beast. "And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue 42 months." So for 42 months, he speaks blasphemies. "Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme His name, His tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven." These are things, again, that the beast will do. And again, the question in in Psalm 74, verse 18, "Be mindful of how the enemy blasphemes the eternal, how base people revile your name." And so then we read about what he's talking about. Now, the majority of humanity will also revile and blaspheme God when they suffer during the bowl plagues. That is what's left of humanity, because 2/3 of humanity has already been destroyed by that point in time. And those who are still alive simply have not yet picked up on what they need to pick up on. But here in chapter 16 of Revelation and verse 8, it says, "Then the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and power was given to him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and they blasphemed the name of God who has power over these plagues. And they did not repent and give Him glory." Notice, they blasphemed the name of God. Verse 10, "Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues because of the pain. They blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and did not repent of their deeds." And so again, back over here in Psalm 74, the question is asked is, be mindful, God. Don't you hear? We've heard. Haven't you heard the blasphemy of this individual and the people that follow him? Verse 19, Psalm 74. "Oh, do not deliver the life of your turtle dove to the wild beast." Or the King James simply says, "the multitude of the wicked." Do not deliver the life of your turtle dove to the multitude of the wicked. Wild beast is fine here because the beast will be a wild individual, will not be civilized whatsoever in what he does. "Do not forget the life of your poor," or the New International and a few other translations, "your afflicted people forever." Do not forget the life of your afflicted people forever. Now, the turtle dove is a very gentle bird that is, minds its own business, and it's apt to be attacked by birds of prey. They will attack doves, and the turtle dove is fairly well defenseless. And God's forsaken people here compare the turtle dove to themselves, to Israel, appealing to God not to allow the beast to totally destroy the nation, but to remember them in their suffering, because they're the afflicted ones. They're the ones going through tribulation, and they're asking for mercy. Verse 20 goes on in the New Living Translation. Remember your covenant promises, for the land is full of darkness and violence. Oh, do not let the oppressed or the afflicted return ashamed. Or Tanakh better has, do not let the afflicted turn away disappointed. Let the poor and needy praise your name. And so here, they appeal to God to remember all of the promises He included with the covenant He made with Israel, especially the ones where God promised mercy. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy 30. This is after the blessings and cursings chapters, chapter 28 into 29, and chapter 30 and verse 1. Now, Deuteronomy 30, verse 1, now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, they're going to come, and after it comes, you need to think about this, but it's going to come on you, which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the eternal your God drives you, and you return, or you turn back to the eternal your God and obey His voice, according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that the eternal your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the eternal your God has scattered you. Skipping down to verse 5, then the eternal your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you will possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. And the eternal your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. Skipping down to verse 9, into verse 9 here. For the eternal will again rejoice over you for good. He will rejoice over you for good, as He rejoiced over your fathers, if you obeyed the voice of the eternal your God to keep His commandments and His statutes, which are written in this book of the law. And if you turn to the eternal your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And so, again, they appeal back here in Psalm 74. Remember your covenant promises. The land is full of darkness and violence. Yes, because it's overrun by the beast. Don't let the oppressed, the afflicted, turn away disappointed. Don't disappoint us. Please come to our aid, is what they're asking here. Verse 22 of Psalm 74 goes on from Tanakh translation. Rise, O God, champion, or Moffat has, vindicate. Vindicate your cause. Rise up and vindicate your cause. In other words, take action. Be mindful that you are blasphemed by base men all day long. Do not forget or do not ignore the voice of your enemies. The tumult of those who rise up against you increases continually. They once again, as they did, back up here in verse 10 and verse 18, they again remind God of the blasphemy being directed toward Him by the beast and the followers of the beast. They plead with Him to take action for the sake now of His name. Not necessarily for them, but for the sake of His name. At the appointed time, God will act. And when He does so, He will do so very decisively. In Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3. and verse 2. New Living Translation has, God says, I will gather the armies of the world into the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will judge them for harming my people, my special possession, for scattering my people among the nations, and for dividing up my land. So he says he's going to do this. He's going to bring them all together. Revelation 19 tells us what happens. Revelation 19, verse 19. This is after the bowl plagues have all been poured out. And whatever's left of humanity, other than the armies that are still standing at this point when we first begin verse 19. And I saw the beast, the kings of the earth and their armies, gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army, that is, against Christ and his army, that is, the saints who follow him out of heaven. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet, who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone, and the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse. And so God will do. He will act just as requested here in the final verses of this psalm.